Let's talk about dreams for a second. Which of these two scenarios sounds more frightening to you? In the first scenario, you lose the ability to dream entirely. That's it. There's no additional pain or suffering, just no dreams. In the second scenario, you can still dream, but those dreams are controlled by another person. You still feel them, you just aren't the one calling the shots. I think, intuitively, most people would say that the second scenario is worse. Yes, losing our dreams would be terrible, but surely the absence of a dream is preferable to the presence of a nightmare, especially one of someone else's invention, right? But in this video, I'm going to try to convince you that it's the first scenario, more than the second, that should terrify us. I'm going to argue, in other words, that dreamlessness is itself a terrible kind of nightmare. In making this argument, this video will focus on just two movies, one of which you've definitely heard of and probably seen, and the other of which there's a good chance you've never encountered. The first was a Best Picture winner. It represented a hugely important moment in American cinema culture, and it earned its director some very well-deserved praise on the international cultural stage. The first movie I'm talking about, of course, is Parasite. The second movie, however, is significantly lesser known, and I think that's a shame. At least when I rewatched it in preparation for this video, it wasn't on any major streaming services, and other than one of my friends, I've yet to encounter, in my day-to-day life, pretty much anyone else who has seen it. That movie is a 2013 Dutch film called Borgman. Though Parasite is the much better known of these two movies, what I want to talk about in this video is how, in many ways, Borgman anticipated the story Parasite has to tell. Borgman was released 6 years before Parasite, and on the surface, these movies are remarkably similar, almost eerily so. And yet, I'm not going to make the argument that Parasite is somehow copying Borgman. I do not think that Parasite is derivative, and I have no interest in making any kind of argument to that end. Parasite is its own film with its own vision, and I have no desire to try to discredit it as a work of art. In fact, it's a movie that means a lot to me, and for that very reason, it's a movie I want to better understand. So, what I want to think through in this video is how these two movies, in spite of their immediate similarities, are fundamentally and immeasurably different. Though their stories are comparable, though they share a great deal of narrative overlap, I think they function in completely unique ways, and I'm interested in the nuances of how and why that is. These two films view the world through different eyes. They leave us as viewers with completely different ideas, and what I ultimately want to argue is that the tragic aspects of these two movies are, far from being the same, actually inversions of one another. In other words, what I want to posit is that the tragedy of Parasite is precisely the opposite of the tragedy of Borgman. Parasite takes Borgman and turns it on its head, and what we're left with, I think, is a much darker, much bleaker vision of the world. And, I think, it's only by looking at these differences that we can more clearly see why the theft of our dreams, more than just their manipulation, is such a tragedy. So, let's get into it. Parasite and Borgman. How are they similar? How are they different? And what can we make of those facts? I'd like to start by simply recapping the stories, emphasizing the ways in which these two movies are, at least on first glance, extremely similar. I assume that, for many of you, the story of Parasite is fresh on your mind. Still, some basic summary might be useful. The film starts underground, where the Kim family lives in a semi-basement, ever threatened by flooding. They're clearly a poor family, the parents are out of work, and they're doing their best to get by, taking on odd jobs when they can. Things change when the son, Ki-woo, receives an offer from a friend named Min. Min asks Ki-woo to pose as a university student and take over his job tutoring the daughter of the wealthy Park family until Min returns home from studying abroad. So, that's what Ki-woo does, and that's when the scamming begins. Ki-woo pretends to be a university student. He takes over the tutoring position in his friend's absence, and then he immediately gets his family involved in the scheme. He realizes that if he can get his family members hired by the Parks, they can, collectively, as a family, bring in huge amounts of money, an enormous transfer of wealth from one household to another. So, they start with his sister, who pretends to be an experienced art therapist, and is hired to work with the family's son, Da-song. Through various acts of deceit, they're able to get both the chauffeur and the housekeeper of the Parks fired, and they promptly have their father and mother, respectively, fill those roles. In short, the entire Kim family is able to root out all of the various service and domestic workers who run the show for the parks and usurp their positions. In the end, all of the Kims are employed by the parks. They have successfully infiltrated the bourgeois home of the Park family through repeated instances of fraud. So that's a basic overview of at least the premise of Parasite. A family of poor workers burrowing their way into the life of an aristocratic family, inhabiting their architectural wonder of a home. Of course, there's more to say here, but for the moment, this will do. Borgman is, in many ways, a movie with a similar story to tell. This film is also set on the grounds of an extraordinarily wealthy family's home, and it involves the same kind of subterfuge as Parasite. A band of strange wanderers, led by a man whose name we ultimately learn is Camille Borgman, gradually infiltrate the luxurious lives of Richard, Marina, and their children. Camille gets himself fraudulently hired as the family's gardener, and he brings his friends Ludwig and Pascal to work alongside him. They take up residence in the family's guest wing and outdoor summer home, and the family seems to genuinely welcome them. They eat dinner at the family table. At one point, Richard, the father forever occupied with his very important job, those words were capitalized if you couldn't tell, even appears to ask Pascal to drive the children to school for him. And these men aren't the only ones who scam the family. Their two female colleagues, Brenda and Ilanka, likewise take up fake identities. They pretend, at various moments of the film, to be doctors, but they too are lying. By the end, Borgman takes us to the very same place Parasite does. A group of fraudsters successfully infiltrating the home and the lives of a family much better off than themselves. So, you see what I mean when I say that, structurally, these films are molded from the same clay. Both detail the gradual decomposition of a wealthy family at the hands of a group of strangers who have managed, by fraud and deceit, to insert themselves into the family like a virus, assimilating to it and rotting it, gnawing it from the inside out. Though the films take place in different countries, even their settings are surprisingly similar. The family homes look relatively the same. They're both spacious, near-empty products of modern architecture. They're blocky, Spartan, bare, like halfway-filled museums. They exude an almost intimidating atmosphere of wealth. They both look like something I will never be able to afford, somewhere I would never feel comfortable. And it isn't just these surface similarities that I find so interesting. There are deeper connections here too, literally deeper. Both movies, for example, concern themselves with the underground. As I mentioned, Parasite starts in a semi-basement. Its opening shot is literally beneath the earth. And if you've seen the movie, you know that basements in general have a huge role to play throughout the film. I think the case could be made that the basement and what it represents is the central preoccupation of Parasite. And Borgman, too, is interested in what happens beneath our feet. Camille, Ludwig, and Pascal all live in burrows underground. The opening sequence of the film is them being rooted out, literally dug up and displaced by a band of vigilantes who seem to believe they have no right to inhabit the dust of this world. And there's even more we could pursue here. Both films feature not just a large, expensive home, but a garden space outside where many of the most important moments of the films will take place. In fact, both films have their climaxes occur outside rather than in. In both cases, the garden will become a place of violence, a place of undoing, and the space that we as viewers will forever associate with the permanent, irrevocable dissolution of the families in question. I think you get the point. Similar settings, similar images, and structurally similar plot lines. And yet, I can't shake the feeling that these movies are, in their cores, deeply, deeply different. So, what I'd like to do now is get into those differences. Rather than stopping here and simply concluding that Parasite is a more recent, culturally distinct rendition of Borgman, that it's basically the same movie set in South Korea rather than Europe, I'd like to talk about the aspects of these movies that, in my view, separate them by light years, make them completely different kinds of stories. These differences are profound, and, for me, they help account for the fact that I leave these movies with remarkably different feelings. The sensation of watching Parasite feels, to me, radically different from the sensation of watching Borgman, and I don't think we can explain that difference with reference to plot alone. Parasite is a movie full of jokes, and yet I leave that movie with a sense of great sadness. Borgman, a much darker movie on paper, doesn't give me that feeling at all. So, why is that? Why does the movie that makes me laugh also leave me in despair? In hopes of giving an answer, let's dig deeper. And this time, I'd like to start with Borgman. There's one thing Borgman makes clear from its opening shot, and in fact, even before that. This is a film with supernatural undertones. It is less literal social commentary and more fable, ghost story, folklore. Before the film even starts, we're greeted with an epigraph on screen. And they descended upon the earth to strengthen their ranks. No attribution is given for the quote. It's just there, printed for us to read. So, here's a fun game. Where do you think that quote comes from? What does it sound like? My first thought was, that's the Old Testament. Or, if not the Old Testament specifically, at least some other piece of scripture, some warning from a holy book. It has that feel to it. The biblical tone, the suggestively violent imagery. And yet, the real answer is that this is a reference to nothing. It isn't in the Bible. In fact, it isn't in any book. It's not a quote, not a reference. It's just here, a sentence floating at the beginning of Borgman. So, to ask a very simple question, what's up with that? Why this pseudo-biblical reference, this hint at a religious allusion? What I think the film is doing here is making something clear to us from the jump. This movie has a spiritual tenor before it even starts. It implies, already, something beyond the natural world, something that would need to descend to the earth because it is not itself a part of that earth to begin with, not a product of human society in the same way that you and I are. And this makes perfect sense when you watch the opening sequence. Remember how I mentioned that Borgman, like Parasite, starts underground? That Camille, Ludwig, and Pascal live in the dirt? Watch for a second how that sequence actually unfolds. 3 men, one of them a priest, carrying guns and sharpened metal stakes, literally driving them into the earth in an attempt to kill. What this evokes, for me, is the imagery of the vampire, the creature that requires a stake through the heart to die. And I think this imagery is intentional. Look at the way Pascal and Ludwig are lying in the dirt. Doesn't it look like they're sleeping in coffins? And by the way, of all people, why is a priest involved? Why does a spiritual leader need to be here, hunting these people? Because, the opening suggests, these aren't people that we're dealing with. They descended to get here. They came from elsewhere, from some unknown alternative space, and so they must be hunted, stopped. They aren't just wanderers with suspicious plans. They represent a deeper threat, something more obscure and frightening. This is, in my view, the vast and unbridgeable distance that separates Parasite and Borgman, the source of their irrefutable separation. While Parasite concerns itself strictly with the real, with the actual social world that produced it, Borgman patently does not. The film repeatedly suggests, you might even say definitively proves, that the wanderers who make up Borgman's posse are not human beings, at least not in the sense that you and I are. They are hunted like vampires. Priests pursue them with weapons designed to kill. And the movie itself repeatedly re-emphasizes the strange and mysterious ways they control the others around them. Take, for example, this still image from the film. This is an image that is repeated multiple times. Marina, in bed with her husband Richard, is beset by horrible nightmares, terrible visions in which her husband beats and abuses her. The nightmares become worse over time. Throughout the course of the movie, they evolve from depictions of Richard hitting and slapping Marina to him holding her down and slicing her with a box cutter, literally ripping the flesh from her muscles, her bones. These images become almost unwatchable, which is why I'm not putting them on screen right now. And what the film explicitly suggests is that Borgman himself is the source of these terrors. Let me show you that image again, this time paired with the painting it's gesturing toward. The painting on the right is an oil painting from the 18th century called The Nightmare, painted by Henry Fuseli. It's an image that depicts an incubus, a demonic entity that haunts women in the night, fornicating with them while they sleep, the male counterpart to a succubus. While Borgman is never shown violating Marina physically, he does seem to be implanting these fearsome visions in her brain. Remember, the painting is called The Nightmare. Over time, these impressions become so intense for Marina that she grows to despise her husband. She fears him, hates him, as if the night visions weren't nightmares or even dreams, but actual memories, things Richard has truly done. Now, a slight caveat here. Richard's character is horrible in the movie. He really is a violent man, and in at least one instance, he's shown to be a racist. Still, in spite of those legitimate problems with his character, the things that Marina sees while Borgman perches on her chest in the dark are not real. She wakes up from these dreams terrified, wild-eyed, and afraid, and she lashes out at her husband. And, more importantly, she begins to develop a deep and almost pathetic sexual attraction to Borgman himself. It is as if, by sitting on her chest while she sleeps, Borgman is forcibly making himself the object of her desire. "Hate your husband and love me instead," he seems to say. It's as if he's broadcasting this thought directly into her mind, funneling it through her flesh with his very body. This is the ultimate conceit of Borgman. These wanderers, these eerie vagabonds, have the ability to control others, to impinge upon their desires and to change them. They can make women hate their husbands. They can even make girlfriends hate their partners. In one sequence in the film, Pascal is shown doing exactly this to the nanny Stina. Her boyfriend has come for dinner, and while helping Marina set the table, Stina wanders out into the garden to cut some flowers. There, she encounters Pascal, who invites her into the outdoor summer house to sit with him. We aren't shown what happens while she's there. The door closes in our face. But by the time she comes back, she seems to suddenly despise her boyfriend. It's a total change of personality, immediate and frightening. She becomes hostile, aggressive, almost petulant, and later she's seen returning to the summer house, happily undressing herself for Pascal. These men, these intruders, these creatures are able to do this. They control, manipulate, and exploit the desires of the people they encounter, implanting fake dreams into their minds and convincing them that they are their own. They don't use weapons or force or any kind of violence to speak of, at least not at the beginning. Their primary means of attack, the mechanism by which they orchestrate their intrusion, is the manipulation of desire. In other words, the most frightening weapon in their holster is fantasy. And even their victims seem to know this, to confirm it with their very response. At one moment, Marina starts to have a breakdown, as if she has suddenly been beset with a realization of what is happening. She says the following lines, which I find chilling. "Sometimes everything seems unreal to me. There is something that surrounds us, the shell of something that means harm." Marina knows that something is wrong here, that some strange and harmful thing has befallen them, but in spite of this intuitive understanding, she won't be able to resist it. It is too strong, and the harm it means is too seductive. All of this stands in stark contrast to Parasite, a movie that explicitly and definitively rules out any dependence on the supernatural. By my count, there is only one meaningful reference to the supernatural in the film, and that occurs when the mother of the Kim family tells Jessica, the false name the sister uses when masquerading as an art therapist, that when he was in the first grade, Da Song saw a ghost. It was his birthday. The family had eaten his favorite cake, and later that evening, he crept downstairs to sneak himself some more. While eating on the floor beside the fridge, he looked up and saw it, a pair of ghostly eyes, which has haunted him ever since. Of course, as we get further into the film, we learn that there was no ghost. That wasn't a spirit, a phantom. It was a real, living, breathing human being, the husband of the original housekeeper who has been hiding out in the secret basement, hiding from the loan sharks who are hounding him while his wife works above. In other words, the movie's only ghost is not a ghost. He's a person, a human, a poor married man himself haunted in turn, not by ghosts but by the money that eludes him and by the men who demand from him what he does not have. He is impoverished, destitute, reduced to a sad and limited existence, but he is nevertheless a person, nothing more and nothing less. He is, to quote Cormac McCarthy, a child of God, much like yourself, perhaps. What I want to argue is that this is a crucial revelation in Parasite. It's the moment when the movie tells us that it is committed to the real. Parasite is not concerned, like Borgman, with strange entities that descend to the earth, haunting our dreams, walking like specters through our homes. Instead, Parasite is intimately and emphatically concerned with the real and turning earth, the physical, material world that is both our home and, at times, our nightmare. There are a number of ways I could try to prove this point to you. First, think about one of the themes that unites these movies, the underground. In Borgman, this imagery is invoked precisely to emphasize the inhumanness of Borgman and his ilk. They sleep in the dirt like vampires, wearing suits. It's strange, and it doesn't feel human. In Parasite, however, the underground represents something else entirely, and I think it's fairly obvious. What it represents is class difference. The poor family lives underground. To go from the Parks house to their own, they have to descend because they are lower, lesser. There's one sequence of the film in particular, during the storm that will flood their home, that emphasizes this explicitly. They go down, and down, and down, further and further lowering themselves at the feet of the towering bourgeois. And again, this is barely even a metaphor. It is actually how people live. In 2022, The Guardian reported that these types of semi-basement homes would be slowly phased out of Seoul following multiple deaths by drowning during a storm. These are real dwellings with real consequences, real homes inhabited by the poor, and so Parasite's engagement with them doesn't feel symbolic, metaphorical. It's too tangible, too immediate. It is all too real. There are other places we can see Parasite's commitment to the real. Think, for example, about the motivations of the characters. Why do the Kims defraud the Parks in the first place? Well, again, the answer is obvious. Because they're poor and need money. They say this explicitly. Their fraud is an attempt to garnish, for themselves, the wealth they've never had. Compare that to the following scene in Borgman. Camille Borgman, the strange figure haunting this family, has decided to leave the house. Rather than be thankful that he's gone, Marina pursues him, begs him to come back, and asks why he wants to leave. Here's what he says in response. "I'm bored," he says. "I want to play." Again, while this is fascinating, it doesn't sound like something a person would say. "I've tired of ransacking your home and manipulating you. I have no interest in actually inhabiting your house. This is just a game to me." Of course, the characters in Parasite could never say this, because to them, none of this is a game. None of it is a joke. This is real life, where the lack of money brings real suffering. Poverty is not something you can simply grow bored of and walk away from. They are motivated by material desires because it is precisely the lack of material wealth that keeps them underground. To give another example, think about the ways the movies establish affinity groups, the ways they show us how and why social bonds are formed. In Parasite, once it's discovered that the husband of the former housekeeper is still living in the basement, the original housekeeper makes a direct plea to the Kim family. "We must stick together," she says. "Don't turn us in. We, all of us, are a group, bonded by something. All of us are needy." And so, again, it is material want, financial insecurity that binds us, that lashes us to one another. In Borgman, it's something else entirely. What we eventually learn is that all of the members of Borgman's crew have the same scar on their back. It's never revealed why that scar is there or what it represents, but we do know it's what unites them. Later in the film, Pascal and Ludwig will give these same scars to the children of the family as well as to Stina. And in the end, these newly scarred children will join the cult and enter the forest with Borgman and the others. Their ranks have finally been strengthened. The film's opening prophecy is fulfilled. The children have been marked, implanted, stamped in the same way, and they have therefore joined the sect. They have undergone the ritual, survived the initiation, and now they are invited into the rites and sacraments of these otherworldly creatures. Again, we see the same distinction. In Parasite, humans are bound to one another by real-world concerns, money and the lack of it. In Borgman, humans are bound to vampires, nightmares, and ghosts by unexplained ceremonies, bizarre and unorthodox carvings of the flesh. This is how I'd like to conclude this section, with this one big claim. While Borgman situates itself immediately within the confines of the spiritual, the supernatural, and the unearthly, Parasite embeds itself within what I might call a defiant realism. No, it says, there are no ghosts. There are no spirits, no phantoms. There are no demons, and we do not need any priests. What haunts us is our own poverty, our destitution, our misery. Those eyes you see in the basement are alive. They weep and redden and are downcast just like your own. There are no creatures here from any other world, and it does not matter what we dream. There is only one world, this one, right here, the one we stand upon, where semi-basements flood and the poor drown, where the rich live on their mountaintops and the rest of us lie in the dust below. It is this world, orbiting this sun, that will be our death or our salvation. Neither priests nor monsters have anything to do with it. Up to this point, this video has involved itself with a great deal of comparison. This aspect of Parasite works like this, while that aspect of Borgman works like that. I want to conclude by bringing these thoughts together, synthesizing them into something like a conclusion. Earlier in this video, I mentioned something about my viewing experience with these two films. Although Parasite has a lot more jokes in it than Borgman, and although Borgman is a much darker movie on paper, what with its demons, its boogeymen, its ritualistic violence, it is Parasite, more than Borgman, that left me with a sense of sadness, a feeling, almost, of intense, personal grief. So, armed with the various ideas we've parsed through so far, the final question I want to ask is, why? Why is it that Parasite, a movie bereft of supernatural, evil entities, a movie that does not have vampirish beings who control human thoughts and desires, is the film that scares me more? To answer this question, I think we need to investigate what exactly it is that constitutes the tragedy of each film's conclusion. I do think both of these films, each in their own way, have a tragic dimension. They both involve the complete dissolution of at least one family, if not more, and they both portray gruesome, often senselessly violent murders. Something is lost in these films, something of the basic humanity that underpins our most fundamental social connections. So, how can we make sense of their endings? In what ways do the tragedies of these two films communicate and disagree with one another? Let's start with Borgman. If I had to summarize what I regard as the tragic error in this film, it would be that the human characters mistake a fantasy for the real. Remember, their desires are no longer their own. Their feelings are manipulated, toyed with, and new images and dreams are implanted into their minds by creatures we do not fully understand. Marina's husband, yes, is a jerk, but he does not do the things her dreams show her. Nevertheless, she acts as if he does, and by the end of the movie, she is so disgusted by the man lying in the bed beside her that she actually asks Borgman to kill him. This is not an instance of an intruder conducting a ghastly murder before a weeping family. Marina wants Richard to die. Or, at least, she thinks she does. So, this is it. This is their great mistake. What they are greeted with is a fantasy, one lodged into the very gray matter of their brains by creatures who have descended here from somewhere. In any case, they take these fantasies to be real. They mistake these alien desires for their own, and they act as if they really did want these things, as if it weren't the case that an incubus has been sitting on their chest in the night, crushing their lungs, halting their breath, broadcasting nightmares about their loved ones through the density of their skulls. That, I think, is what Borgman wants to show us, that it is dangerous for us to become too caught up in a fantasy, especially one that originated elsewhere, one that isn't originally ours. It tells us that fantasy itself is a danger, a temptation, that in pulling us away from the real, it drags us into some new realm, someplace far more frightening, more bizarre, and less human. The tragedy of Parasite, I want to suggest, is exactly the opposite. If Borgman's tragedy is mistaking a fantasy for the real, then in Parasite, the tragedy is mistaking the real for a fantasy. Let me explain what I mean. The scene that I find most depressing in this movie, and the scene that I want to conclude with, is, naturally, its ending. This might seem strange at first. If you remember, the final shot of the movie is Ki-woo hugging his parents in the garden of the fancy house. Seems peaceful, right? A slow, careful embrace shared by a family that has been through so much and is still mourning the loss of their daughter. But there's something very, very important to remember here. This scene is itself a fantasy. It isn't actually occurring. After the murders in the garden of the park home, Ki-woo's father goes into hiding, and no one, his family included, knows where he is. It is only later that his son discovers, thanks to his knowledge of Morse code, that his father is in the house, that he is hiding in the very basement the family so recently escaped from. And so, he writes his dad a letter where he details his dream, to become wealthy enough to buy the house and free his father. The film shows us a short scene of what realizing this dream might look like, and then the movie ends. So, why is this so sad? How could this be the source of my grief while watching the film? The reason I find it sad is because, well, is that really the best thing he could dream of? Again, this is a fantasy. We're in the realm of imagination, where there are no restrictions, no rules. Ki-woo is free to dream whatever he'd like. He could imagine, for example, the elimination of all semi-basements from South Korea. He could imagine a world where the impoverished are not forced to live underground, not forced by their economic condition to endure degrading, inhuman treatment. He could imagine a brighter world, a more peaceful one, where every family is able to afford the home that suits them, where everyone can tend their garden and celebrate the birthdays of their children. But no, Ki-woo doesn't imagine any of this. The best he can do, the best fantasy he can concoct, is to simply become rich himself and take over the house. He dreams, in other words, of becoming the Park family, of completely and permanently inhabiting the position of wealth occupied by their former employers. And what I want to suggest is that this vision, this dream, is sad precisely because it isn't really a dream. It's barely a fantasy at all. Within the freedom of his own imagination, with no rules or money systems or political regimes to hold him back, all Ki-woo can manage is something all too real. He doesn't want to dismantle the conditions that put his family in their position in the first place. He doesn't want to topple the hierarchy to fashion a better world. He simply wants them to be on top. He wants them to live in the house. Someone else can take the basement. I think Parasite is a movie that knows its ending is sad. Bong Joon-ho is a thoughtful, politically conscious filmmaker, and so I want to be clear that this ending is, by my reading, not accidental. There's a saying that's become popular with cultural theorists over the years. It originated with Frederick Jameson, but has since been taken up and modified by thinkers like Slavoj Žižek and Mark Fisher. Basically, the thought is this: it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Capital, like an incubus, has such a hold over our cultural imagination that we literally cannot envision our lives without it. If this sounds suspicious to you and you want some evidence, think about the movies we make, the stories we tell ourselves in books and TV shows. Think about the scenarios we allow ourselves to entertain as plausible. World-destroying meteor? Sure, we can make movies about that. Global, devastating plague? Why not? That's barely even fiction. Visitation by aliens intent on enslaving, torturing, or murdering us? Of course, three-body problem rules. But an economic system other than capitalism? No way. As soon as you mention that in conversation, people start to look at you funny. The tragedy here is precisely that we cannot fantasize enough, that our fantasies themselves are insufficiently fantastic, that they are far, far too real, that even when given the freedom to think without limitation in our own minds, we find ourselves in chains. This, I think, is what Parasite stages for us in its conclusion. Borgman is concerned about what happens when we believe in the fantasies of others as if they were real, as if they were ours. Parasite, however, greets us with a much more frightening proposition. What if, it asks, we've lost the ability to fantasize altogether? What if, even when we think we're stepping into fantasy, we're really still stuck in the real, reproducing its very conditions, rehashing its flaws and restrictions? And so, yes, I find Ki-woo's letter to his father to be deeply, deeply sad. Would it be great if the Kims could afford the house, if they could find themselves marvelously wealthy, on par with the Parks? Sure, that would be great for them. But there would still be other poor people. There would still be other families drowning in basements, drowning in debt, and drowning in shame, and the possibility the film leaves us with is that this is a cycle with no end. One wealthy family moves out of the house and another moves in. And yet, regardless of who inhabits it, regardless of who hires the housekeeper and the driver and who hangs the artwork on the walls, there will always be someone in the basement. Not a ghost, not a nightmare, but a person. A person with open eyes and a pulsing heart, yearning for something better. This, finally, is why I find Parasite's vision much more frightening. Yes, of course, it would be terrible if my household were visited by a weird posse of demons, if they controlled my thoughts and I believed they were my own, but at least that feels like a tangible threat, something I can hunt down with a shotgun or a stake, something I can ask the priest to take care of when church is over and the pews empty. But Parasite presents us with a much bleaker thought. What if you couldn't even dream? Or what if, in dreaming, you found that your own thoughts were shackled? What if all of your wildest fantasies, all of the hopeful visions you might forge for your own future and that of your family, are themselves always already restricted, confined, without you even knowing it? What if all we had was the real? What if our fantasies weren't manipulated, but stolen altogether? What if a slightly bigger house, a slightly nicer garden, really is the best we can do? What if those eyes we see in the basement really are living people, and we, our imagination stilted, can't think of any way to free them? What if there really are families drowning at our feet?